It starts quietly, like most things that eventually break your heart, not with a loud betrayal or an obvious collapse, but with something far gentler, more innocent, a thought that drifts in while you're half awake in the early morning light, or a vision that visits you in the stillness between two busy moments. It's so subtle you don't even recognize it as the beginning of anything at all, just a simple image of how things might unfold, how the days ahead might look if only the world would follow the quiet harmony you feel inside. At first, it's harmless, a thought you don't even notice yourself rehearsing, a slight curve in the future, where things go right, where the person understands you, without having to explain yourself 3 times, where the timing lines up like stars in a storybook sky, where the door opens not because you forced it, but because you were meant to walk through it all along. And maybe you don't call it hope, maybe you don't call it planning, maybe you don't call it anything, because naming it would make it real, and you're not ready for that kind of attachment yet. But still, you begin to lean, gently, subconsciously, as if placing a little weight on a branch you've seen others use before, a branch that seems strong enough, familiar enough, reliable enough, to carry the quiet weight of your belief. You didn't know that branch had already cracked. You didn't hear it splintering beneath the surface. You only realize it when it gives way, not with rage, not with cruelty, not even with resistance, just absence, just a silence that stretches too long, a no that never gets spoken, but echoes louder than any scream, a gesture that should have come but didn't, and you fall, not because you were careless, but because you believed. And belief, when it is not met, when it is not returned, does not break. It collapses inward, into you. And the strange thing is, it's not the fall that wounds you the most. It's that moment just before, when you still thought it was going to hold. That instant of suspended trust, when you were still standing in the story. Eyes open, heart open, certain that the universe was about to meet you right where you were. That's what leaves the bruise, not the drop, not the ground, but the moment you still believed, just before you knew better. And that's the part most people never really see, that you weren't being dramatic, or entitled, or unrealistic. You weren't expecting too much. You were simply expecting what already felt real, what already felt close, what already seemed to be blooming inside you, like a spring that had silently arrived after a long, cold season. You weren't trying to force anything. You were simply listening to what your heart told you was unfolding, gently, honestly, inevitably. But somehow, without doing anything wrong, without even asking for more than what was fair, you find yourself in a moment where the story in your mind and the reality in front of you begin to part ways, not with a crash, but like 2 boats drifting slowly in opposite directions through a morning fog, and suddenly you're standing between them, arms stretched out to both sides, trying to hold on to both visions at once, watching them slip further and further apart, and wondering, in your quietest moments, which one was ever truly real. And this is the strange, quiet ache of disappointment, that it doesn't shout, it hums. It lingers like perfume on a sweater you can't throw away. It follows you into rooms where no one else knows you're grieving. It whispers in the spaces between your thoughts. It shows up not just when something fails to happen, but when something you believed in becomes a ghost that never lived outside your imagination. And maybe, just maybe, the hardest part isn't the outcome itself, but the part of you that trusted, the part that softened, the part that waited patiently, the part that opened just enough to let light in, and now doesn't know how to close without shutting everything out, because now you're left with a version of yourself that lived inside a version of the future that never came, and somehow, that version of you still feels real, still feels close, still feels like home, and so you're left walking through your life with echoes, not of what was, but of what almost was. And those echoes are heavy in a way that few people understand, because they don't mourn the dream or the hope or the plan. They mourn the version of you that believed it all could still happen. But even now, in the middle of the ache, in the hollow space where expectation once lived, something else begins to stir, something not loud, not quick, not eager to replace what was lost, but quiet, patient, present, and that is the beginning of something new. There's something most of us quietly carry, tucked beneath our logic and even beneath our faith, the soft but persistent belief that if we live with intention, if we give with an open heart, if we hold on to hope with clean hands and good motives, then surely life will reward us with the version of reality we've been holding gently in our minds. and not a fantasy, not something unreasonable, but just a simple unfolding that mirrors the care we've poured into the process. We believe, even if we don't say it out loud, that if we show up with enough sincerity, the universe will meet us halfway. And so we start rehearsing, privately, silently, building scenes in our head that feel more like memory than imagination. We think of the way they'll look at us when they finally understand. We imagine the moment everything aligns, the job calls back, the effort pays off, the conversation opens the door we were waiting to walk through. It feels close, real, inevitable. But no one tells you how often those private rehearsals never reach the stage, how often the script never sees the light, how often the most intimate expectations go unmet, not because you were wrong to feel them, but because life never agreed to play the part you cast for it. No one tells you that even the most well-meaning expectation can become a trap, that what starts as innocent hope can twist itself into silent suffering when it's tied too tightly to a specific outcome. Expectation doesn't arrive like a villain. It wears light, it comes dressed as clarity, it walks in as trust, but it's not always what it seems. Slowly, without warning, it begins to demand something back. Not overtly, but quietly. You start giving from a place of purity, and somewhere along the way you start waiting for the reply, for the recognition, for the return. And now your love has conditions. Your effort has measurement. Your peace is on hold until something arrives. The sacred has been touched by a quiet form of control, and here is where the suffering begins. The mind is a master illusionist, capable of painting entire futures in detail, outlining what should happen, when it should happen, and exactly how it should feel when it does. It tells us, if I give this, I should receive that. If I stay long enough, I should be chosen. If I sacrifice this, I should be rewarded with that. And as we believe those silent contracts, we begin to forget that life was never obligated to sign them. And when life, in its mystery, its rhythm, its untamable nature, chooses another path, when the outcome we predicted doesn't come, or comes too late, or comes looking like something else entirely, we don't just feel disappointment, we feel betrayed, but not by people, not by chance, by life itself. And yet, if we're honest, life didn't betray us, it just never agreed to the terms we set without its consent. There was a woman once who dreamed of living beside the sea. Since she was a child, she imagined herself on a small porch, tea in hand, breeze in her hair, watching the waves roll in like faithful companions. For decades she saved, sacrificed, worked harder than she had to. Every decision she made was a step toward that vision. And then, just as she was ready, just as the moment had arrived, her partner fell ill, the kind of illness that makes you put the ocean on hold. And so she stayed, as she should, and the house by the sea became someone else's story. Years later, she sat with a younger woman who asked her if she ever regretted not getting the life she'd imagined. She smiled and said, "I do live beside the sea. I just didn't know it was inside him." She had found a different kind of depth, a different kind of tide, in the life that happened instead. And she hadn't missed her dream. She had simply discovered that some dreams change shape when we stop insisting they look exactly as we pictured. The pain doesn't come from not getting what we wanted. It comes from believing it had to look one way in order to be good. It comes from mourning a version of life that never got to exist. A version that, in truth, may have only ever existed in our minds. And what makes it even harder is that even when life blesses us, even when joy finds us, it almost never shows up in the form we imagined. We find connection in strangers, meaning in failure, purpose in endings. But we miss these gifts if we are still mourning the life we rehearsed but never lived. We don't cling because we're foolish. We cling because we think it will protect us. We think holding tighter will keep us safe. But often, holding tighter is the very thing that makes the letting go hurt more. And the strange loop begins. The more we suffer, the more we try to control. The more we try to control, the more we expect. The more we expect, the more we suffer. Until, by grace or exhaustion, we reach a moment of stillness, a moment of surrender, not a dramatic breakdown, just a quiet breath, a shift, a question. What if I stopped needing life to be anything other than what it is? What if I allowed it to surprise me? What if I stopped trading the present for a version of the future I've never truly known? And that question, whispered in the ruins of our rehearsals, becomes the beginning of freedom. There comes a moment, not with fanfare or flashing signs, but quietly, so quietly, that you almost miss it, a moment that arrives not in the thunder of breaking, but in the soft realization that you are tired, not tired in your body, but in that invisible place behind your ribs where you've been carrying too much for too long, tired of gripping, tired of trying to hold it all together, tired of the inner tug of war between how it is and how you thought it would be. And in that moment, as natural as an exhale, as honest as silence, you feel it, the slow melting of something that no longer needs to be held, a truth, rising gently through the noise, that the weight you've been carrying wasn't the thing itself, but your unwillingness to let it go, that the grip, your grip, was the very thing making it hurt, and so you don't explode, you don't shatter, you simply loosen your fingers. Letting go doesn't look like surrendering to failure, it looks like waking up. It looks like remembering that not everything you hold was ever meant to be yours, and not every story you wrote in your head was meant to live in the world. It looks like no longer mistaking attachment for commitment or control for care. You can still love, you can still dream, you can still offer your full self to the moment, but you can no longer afford to build your identity around outcomes. There was once a woman who tended a garden behind her small cottage. Every spring she planted sunflowers in the same corner. For 7 years they bloomed, tall, golden, beaming toward the sky. And every year she watched them like they were old friends returning from a long journey. But in the 8th year a storm tore through the valley. The soil shifted, the seeds were washed away. And when spring came, there was only silence where her sunflowers used to be. She waited, she watered, she watched, but they never came. One evening, she took her chair to that same corner, sat down with her hands in the earth, and wept. She wept not just for the flowers, but for the version of herself that had been rooted in their return. She had built part of her joy around their presence, and now she was face to face with the emptiness where beauty used to live. But something unexpected happened. As she sat in that quiet emptiness, not demanding, not bargaining, just sitting, she began to feel something else. A breeze she had never noticed before. A bird song she had always overlooked. The weight she had been carrying, the waiting, the hoping, the needing began to lift. Not because the sunflowers returned, but because she no longer needed them to. That is the moment of true release. Letting go is not bitterness. It is not resignation. It is not a declaration that life has failed you. It is the quiet return to what was never broken to begin with. Your ability to be present, to be whole, to be at peace with what is, instead of endlessly warring with what could have been. You don't stop caring. You stop gripping. You don't stop hoping. You stop clinging. You don't stop believing. You stop insisting. You begin to understand that life has its own language, one you may not always speak, one that doesn't always follow your logic, but one that, if listened to closely enough, reveals something much deeper than the surface of your plans. Letting go is not passive. It is an act of inner clarity. It is standing in the middle of uncertainty and saying, I will still walk forward. I will still give love. I will still show up, but I will not demand that this moment owe me anything. And when you release the illusion of control, something happens. You breathe differently. You walk lighter. You smile more, not because everything is how you wanted it, but because you've stopped arguing with what's already here. The world didn't change. You did. And in that shift, that soft, quiet surrender, you find a kind of freedom you had forgotten existed. The freedom to feel joy that isn't dependent on things going your way. The freedom to rest, not because everything is finished, but because you are no longer held hostage by what is unfinished. This is the sacred art of letting go. Not letting go of love, not letting go of dreams, but letting go of the story that says things must happen a certain way in order for your heart to be at peace. And when you truly let go, not from bitterness, not from defeat, but from clarity, you begin to see again. You begin to receive again. You begin to live again, not in the future, not in the memory, but here, now. There is a kind of peace that doesn't arrive through victory, but through surrender. Not the kind of surrender that feels like giving up, but the kind that feels like coming home. A soft, slow realization that perhaps all this time you weren't meant to shape life like clay, but to hold it like water, open-handed, open-hearted, watching it move in ways you never expected, but maybe always needed. Because after all the effort, after all the planning, after all the hoping and rehearsing, something inside you begins to shift. Not because the outcome changed, but because you did. You stopped gripping, you stopped demanding, you stopped believing that peace would only come when life looked a certain way. And in the space left behind by that letting go, something quietly beautiful takes root. You begin to notice things again. Not grand, not dramatic, just real. The way morning light falls across the wall, the breath you forgot you were breathing, the way someone you love laughs when they forget the world is watching, and somehow it all feels like enough. Not because it's perfect, but because it's here. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the most profound kind of freedom is the one you find when you stop chasing what was never yours to control. Maybe life isn't asking you to fix or to force, but to feel, to show up, to listen. What if this, exactly as it is already full of meaning? What if you didn't need to get everything right to be at peace? What if the only thing standing between you and the life you long for is your refusal to stop writing the script? Would you be willing to let go just a little more? To stop waiting for closure that may never come? To stop measuring your life against a version that only ever lived in your mind? Would you be willing to trust this moment, even if it's quiet, uncertain, unfinished? Would you? Because here, right here, is where life waits. Not in the outcomes, not in the expectations, but in the stillness beneath it all. And maybe, just maybe, that is more than enough.